All right, so I think it's time to go to the next paper. Everyone seems to be here. A bit difficult to check, to be honest, but at least the speaker and the discussant is here. So the next paper will be presented by Yaniv Greenstein from IDC and Cornell. And it is entitled Corporate Environmental Policy and Product Market Competition. Yaniv, you have 30 minutes.
Thank you very much. Thank you for inviting us to present the paper. This is a joint work with Yelena Larkin, who's also here at the panel. We've been talking, now it's basically the second day, about corporate social responsibility and environmental policy. And we all know that in recent years, corporations have been increasingly pressured to reduce their impact on the environment. This is coming from several directions, from policymakers, from environmental groups, from the consumers, from the investors, employees, to name a few, who all demand actions to change the way corporations behave. We also know that not all firms respond equally to the calls. We have some firms that make massive investments and they really adhere to these calls, while others resist the pressure and do not alter their operations. And indeed, in this discussion, in the literature in recent years, we all try to evaluate what exactly determines the environmental protection policy and what are the pros and the cons, and what are the economic forces that shape that decision. In this study, we are interested in understanding the effect of product market competition on corporate environmental policy. And when examining that question, we come up with several economic forces that could shape that decision. We're all aware that when firms face enhanced product market competition, there are incentives to become more efficient, there are incentives to cut costs, there are incentives to maximize profit, and that could come at the expense of environmental protection. If firms need to decide whether to put more money into production efficiency versus protecting the environment, they might have stronger incentives to go towards profit maximization. On the other hand, and this is a point that was made also yesterday by Akey and Apple, enhanced competition could also enhance efficiency. That could reduce environmental impact. If firms try to become more efficient, then they might be able to use less resources to make the final good. And if they use less resources, the externality might also be lower, be smaller. We know in the literature that there are also other forces, for example, product differentiation. We have Servais and Tamayo that show that companies can differentiate themselves to cater to customers. And the way they do it is they try to become more environmentally conscious so that customers will buy their product. Equilibrium in such an environment could be a separating equilibrium where some companies might choose to become more environmentally friendly while others will not. The competition force could really enhance that tendency. And finally, we have also investor concerns. If competition leads more environmentally conscious investors to invest in those companies, then that could lead to enhanced environmental protection. And finally, companies who compete might have different attitude towards legal risk. If they face liabilities, they might be wiped out from the economy, so they might be much more concerned about that legal risk, and therefore they might reduce their environmental impact. So what we do in this study is we examine a very interesting quasi-natural experiment of the restructuring of the electric utility industry in the US on emission by electric utilities. Now, clearly, we're focusing on one particular industry rather than looking at the entire economy, but we choose that industry because it offers several advantages. The first advantage is that it is a very important industry. Electric utilities are one of the most polluting industries in the world, and therefore it is important to understand the forces that shape their decisions on how much to pollute. The second advantage of this setting is the deregulation or the restructuring that led to enhanced competition in that industry was done in different states at different times. So that brings a very nice setup where we can study this in a diff and diff structure and diff and diff process. We also have lots of information about the decisions at the plant level. So because the regulator asks utilities to provide lots of information, we know a lot about what's going on in those plants. We know about their decision to abate pollution. We know about their decision to make investments. We know about their efficiency. We know a lot about them. There's a lot of information about them. And finally, the product that is being produced by electric utilities is a homogeneous product. It's electricity. And the observable space of actions that affect pollution and emission is relatively well understood. And therefore, we can really dive into the decision process of the plant and examine the cost and benefits of each of those decisions that could affect pollution and understand the motive behind them. So the rest of my presentation will involve a background where I'm going to talk a little bit more about the electric industry, electric generation, and the restructuring. Then I'm going to talk about the data, introduce the results, and finish with the conclusion. So we are focusing on steam turbine electric plants powered by fossil fuel. These plants are responsible for 70% of electricity in the United States at that time. And even today, they have a very large chunk of electricity production, even though there has been a move towards more environmentally friendly processes. The main type of fossil fuels that is being used in those plants is one of three types: either coal, petroleum, or gas. And the basic process that is involved is you burn the fossil fuel to create heat. The heat heats the water, creates steam, and the pressurized steam is being used to turn a turbine, and the turbine itself is connected to an electric generator that generates electricity. So it's a relatively simple process by which electricity is being produced. If you look at plants, you would see that plants differ from one another on several dimensions. One of the most important dimensions is the distinguishing between baseload power plants and peaking power plants. There are some power plants that produce electricity pretty much continuously. These are often coal-based, and the reason they are coal-based is that coal is often very cheap to use for electricity, and also it's very hard to stop and start a coal-based plant. It's very costly because you need to heat the coal again, and that involves a lot of energy and a lot of cost. Therefore, the tendency is to have coal plants as the base load plants. And then utilities have some plants that they call the peaking power plants. These plants, many days of the year do not operate, but then if there is a peak in demand, you start operating them. They're often more expensive, and the cost is basically transferred to the consumer. As I mentioned, electric generating plants affect the environment. And here in this study, we're going to focus on one important effect on the environment, and that is pollution. The worst fossil fuel to use for electric generation is coal. Coal has a lot of pollutants in it, and the burning of coal is associated with lots of side effects. For the most part, we have the sulfite dioxide that is being brought to the air and could affect the lungs. We have also nitric oxide, we have particulate matter that creates smog, etc. Petroleum has somewhat less of pollutive content than coal, but still is pollutive. And out of the three, gas is the least polluting one, even though gas would have also CO2 effect. But if you consider one of those three, gas would be the most environmentally friendly. Clearly, plants need to abide to regulations, and the important regulation that they need to abide to is the Clean Air Act. The Clean Air Act had a very important amendment in 1990, and we'd like to talk about it a little bit because this will also affect our analysis, and this is the acid rain program. It had basically two phases where the regulator decided to enhance regulation regarding pollution in electric utilities and looked for high emitting plants, and the way it requires them to reduce their emission is basically put them on a list and told them you have several years to get to certain normal levels. In our period of study, we had the phase 1 acid rain program that focused on about 6% of all plants in our sample and asked them to reduce their emissions. So we need to control for that. If we look at plants and we ask, well, what is the space of actions that plant can take to reduce their effect on the environment? There are basically three main ways by which they can do that. The first, and it's probably the most obvious one, is to move to a less polluting fossil fuel. So if you move to gas from coal, clearly the effect on the environment will be quite substantial. You can also change the content of pollutants in the coal. You can buy coal that has less pollutive content, for example, coal with less sulfur, and that will reduce the emission when you burn the coal. The second thing by which you can reduce the impact of electric utility on the environment is to treat the flue gas. Okay? The gas that is being emitted from the burning of the fossil fuel can be captured using a chemical process. And for that, you need a device. One of the important devices that is being used is what we call scrubbers. And these are desulfurization devices to capture the sulfide and then allow a more cleaner emission to the air. And the last thing by which utilities can reduce their impact is by increasing efficiency. Efficiency we defined as the output relative to the input. So if you can, with the same heat amount, and I'm going to show you, we define it in Bridges thermal units, the amount of heat, if you can produce more electricity, more megawatt hours for the same heat, then you basically are increasing efficiency and reducing your impact on the environment. So in our analysis, we're going to focus and look at these three dimensions. Let me talk a little bit about restructuring. Historically, electric utilities in the US operated for the most part as vertically integrated regulated monopolies with a localized geographic market. If you look at ownership structure of those plants, those utilities, for the most part, these were investor-owned utilities, or IOU. This means that these were private investors that just put their money to build power plants. Minority of them are owned by public government, or for the most part, local municipalities, basically owned by the consumers and operate to provide electricity to a particular city or a particular area. When the when the electricity production is regulated, the regulator set the price of the electricity based on the operating cost and the capital expenditure cost of the utility itself. Now, this sounds quite easy, but in fact, this is a very lengthy process. It's called a rate case. Whenever there is a change in the cost of the company will need to come to the government, to the local government, and ask for a change in the rate. Then there will be a hearing, and there will be a big process of attempting to change these rates. The regulator itself could also come and ask for a rate change. That could happen, for example, if the costs have gone down and the price is still high, and the regulator would like to reduce that price. Now, in the early 90s, there has been an increase in the price of electricity. There was an increase in demand and relatively limited capacity, possibly somewhat because of this lengthy process of asking for, renewing or increasing the capacity of plants and asking for a higher price for that. And in some states, there have been calls to open the market for competition. And what we mean by competition is allowing plants from outside the states to compete for electricity for the consumers, and basically changing that entire structure of the utilities. In other words, separating between generation and distribution. So the restructuring itself involved 23 states plus the District of Columbia during the time where we look at that. That's between 1990 and 1999. We note that later in 2000 and later on, there have been actually some calls to step back from the regulation, mostly because of the case of California. And some states indeed decided to stop it. We focus on this earlier period to avoid contaminating our results with changes in the perception because of these cases. What does opening the market to competition mean? First of all, it will be unbundling the generation and the distribution. Most of the states that decided to restructure their utilities did it in the form of what we call wholesale competition. That meant that the distributor would be perhaps one distributor to sell the electricity to the customer, but that distributor would need to buy the electricity from the cheapest source. And those generators would compete with one another over price. There have been exchanges for electricity that were established to do that thing in the most efficient way possible. We also note that there has been also, in some cases, what we call retail restructuring, where in some states, the end consumer could decide from which distributor to buy the electricity. And finally, that regulation affected mostly those invested-owned utilities. Municipal utilities were, for the most part, exempted from that deregulation, but they were allowed also to take part of it if they wanted. So let me talk a little bit about the data. We combined the data from several sources. All these sources are publicly available. Emission data is taken from the Environmental Protection Agency website, the EPA. We focus on sulfide dioxide emission because we have that information going back to 1985, even though in the earlier years we had only every 5 years we could spot the amount, so 85, 90, 95, and then going to 99. But the rest of the information, we have it actually going back to 85, all the production information. But for emission, this is only with SO2 we were able to do that. And SO2 is one of the most important pollutants, so we're not worried about that. Plus, we truly believe that the effect on SO2 would also be the similar effect on the other pollutants because they are very highly correlated with one another, depending on the decision of the of the plant, whether to adhere to environmental norms or to enhance environmental protection or not. The plant level data comes from the EIA. This is the Energy Information Administration. We focus on two filings that every utility needs to file, the 767 and 423. It provides very detailed information about plant level decisions, including prices of coal, prices of gas, prices of many other things, investments, etc. We combine that also with a source of data that comes from several places, but eventually was brought together by Fabrizio, Rose, and Wolfram in the AER paper in 2007, where they look at similar setup, but asking a different question. So our sample includes basically 589 facilities over the period 85 to 99. This is just a snapshot of the statistics. You can see the total output of a utility is about 3.5 million megawatt hour. This is consistent also with other studies. You can also see that the emission in ton, the average emission in tons of SO2 is 24,000 tons per year. So in our basic specification, we run a panel regression, basically different regression, where on the left-hand side, we put the amount of SO2 that is being emitted by the utility. And we run it against a dummy variable for whether at the plant level, SO2 at the plant level, and we put it against a dummy variable for whether that plant restructured or was in a state that restructured itself or not. We also control for the amount being produced, whether the plant has a scrubber, and whether it is under the phase one program of the Clean Air Act. And what we find is that overall, if we run regression number one, we see a decrease in restructured plants, decrease in SO2 emission. Part of that decrease comes from the fact that these plants have reduced the amount of electricity being produced. So in column 2, we control for the net megawatt hour, and we see that it still holds. And we also see that it is mostly coming from the larger plants, suggesting that there is an economic impact from these decisions. And it also concentrates in IOU, invested-owned utilities, rather than munis, probably because it's coming from the deregulation. We also look at parallel trends, and we find that indeed the effect comes from period T. T is the time where the restructuring started to take place. So we believe that this is not coming from a parallel trend, a decrease in restructured states in emission altogether. The next thing we do is we try to understand, where does this decrease in emission come from? Does it come from reduced abatement or increased abatement? Does it come from change in the fuel? Does it come from efficiency? So the first thing we look at is abatement. And what we do is we run this panel regression where the dependent variable is the amount of the expense on abatement, the annual expense on abatement by the plant. And what we can see that there has been a decrease in abatement expenses in restructured firms compared to non-restructured firms. And we thought, well, maybe it's because there was some large expenditure done, maybe scrubbers, maybe firms put scrubbers in restructured states. We do not find that. We do find that phase one was really important in increasing the use of scrubbers, but we did not see a change in these abatement costs. If anything, they have decreased them. Now, part of the effect could come from the fact that maybe they moved from the more polluting coal to less polluting, perhaps, gas, and maybe that's the reason expenses have gone down. And so what we do in the next panel is we focus only on coal operating plants, and we control for the amount of coal that was used. And even there, we see massive decreases in abatement expenses after the restructuring, clearly compared to non-restructured states. The second thing we look at is the fuel mix. Did they move to a more environmentally friendly fuel relative to non-regulated plants. And what we find is that indeed there is a move towards gas in restructured utilities and a move away from petroleum. Coal plants almost haven't changed according to this regression. We also look at coal itself. Do we see an enhanced quality of the coal as a result of the restructuring? Do we see a reduction in the amount of sulfur in the coal because plants can buy less polluting coal, and that would reduce the emission? What we find is actually, in fact, they have increased the amount of sulfur in the coal. That is often the cheaper one. So they basically moved away from less polluting coal to more polluting coal. The last thing we look at is the efficiency. Has efficiency increased in those plants? And the way we capture efficiency, we run a regression where we put the total heat input as our dependent variable, and we control for the total output. And what we'd like to see is whether the restructuring was associated with a reduction in input compared to output. And what you can see in column 1 is that there has been a decrease of about 1.2% in the amount of BTU needed to produce 1 unit of megawatt hour. That means basically increased efficiency. Now, why do we see that increased efficiency? One of our conjectures is that the competition itself led to more evening out of the cost across utilities. In other words, a more optimal allocation of resources across different utilities, across different plants. Plants that were in overcapacity would have charged larger prices because they face larger costs, whereas those that are underutilized would compete and would offer lower prices. And by doing that, you basically even out the production process across the plants. And indeed, we find that the capacity factor, which is basically how much energy is being produced compared to the amount of energy that can be produced by the plant, has decreased in the restructured state. And along with that, we see that the megawatt hour also decreased. And the last thing we do is when we...
So 4 or 5 minutes left.
Yeah, thank you. When we put the capacity factor in our original regression, we find that it is indeed explaining a lot of the decrease in the BTU. And after doing that, the restructured dummy variable is no longer significant. So to summarize, we don't find any evidence of increased abatement. If anything, we see a decrease in abatement. We do find a change in fuel mix, less petroleum, more gas, which could lead to a decrease in emission. We do find increased production efficiency. So the overall summary of the overall conclusion that we have is that we do see some things that are consistent with cost cutting and less consistent with investor pressure to become more green or legal risk to become more green. Now, to further understand if the move to gas was also cost-cutting decision, what we do is we dive deeper into that decision. We look at all of our plants in the sample and we look at the price they paid for coal, petroleum, and gas per British thermal units, per energy produced. And in that time, coal was the cheapest, gas was in between, and petroleum was the costliest. So it could be the reason why they moved from petroleum to gas. To further figure out if this is indeed the case, what we do is we introduce a measure of the cost structure of the plant. And that is basically given by the price of the, in the state where the plant was before the deregulation. The price itself reflects basically the cost plus assumption or the cost plus process. And so what we do is we run that regression of whether the change in petroleum to gas was indeed higher when the cost before restructuring was higher. That would provide strong incentives for the utility or for the plant to move away from the costlier fuel to the less costlier fuel. And indeed, we find evidence that is consistent with that. The combined explanatory variable has a negative effect on fuel costs. In other words, when the price was high of electricity before restructuring, plants had stronger incentives to reduce the cost. And that is also the time where they increased the amount of gas and decreased the amount of petroleum. Don't have much time, but we also try to estimate to understand whether maybe the customer channel is here at play. In other words, what we see is probably maybe driven by some plants trying to become more environmentally friendly, and some plants say we're not in that game to cater to customers. If there's more competition, maybe this is the case. And to understand if this is coming from there, from that channel, we differentiate between the states that had what we call the wholesale competition and the states that had the retail competition. We expect the customers to have an effect only if we are in a retail restructuring. In other words, where the consumer can choose where to get the electricity for. If we have only in the wholesale position, we think that this is going to be less of that choice across consumers. And what we find is when we put both dummies, one for the retail restructuring, one for the regular restructuring, we find that the retail restructuring doesn't really have any load. In other words, it's inconsistent with the customer channel. So to conclude, we see a change in pollution after restructuring, change in fuel mix, more gas, less petroleum, higher production efficiency. And the evidence in our conclusion suggests that it is coming from cost-cutting incentives rather than incentives to improve the environment. That comes from this mixed evidence that we find, and the fact that we do not find that the customer channel or the other channels are at play here. One could conclude that well, maybe we should increase the market for competition or open the market for competition to reduce emission. We caution against that conclusion because it was really because gas was cheaper than petroleum, according to what we find. If it was the opposite, perhaps electric utility plants had increased their pollution. And so a more subtle takeaway is providing perhaps incentives to switch to low emission technology would be more beneficial when you have more competition, because there's more incentives for the plant to do something like that. Thank you.
Thank you, Yaniv. The discussant is Patrick Akey from University of Toronto.
All right. Thank you for including me as a discussant in the conference, and thank you to Yaniv and Yelena for sending for such an interesting paper. So as Yaniv pointed out or discussed, the paper studies the effect of relaxing state-level restrictions that limited competition on utilities. He studies these effects on their subsequent environmental policy. And they combined very detailed emissions data from a variety of sources with 27 deregulation events in the mid-1990s. And I'm not going to talk too much about the data, but I should say that having worked with some of this data myself, this is actually even more detailed than many of the other data sources. And there was a lot of effort involved in sort of patching this together, and I commend the authors for that. And what they find is that following one of these deregulation events, utility emissions declined by 18%. These results are not explained by increased investment in abatement activities, and that this is driven by a shift to more efficient production. So this is a better choice of inputs and better use of capacity. And so the main takeaway is that policies promoting competition or incentivizing cleaner technologies can have positive environmental spillovers, in particular through this efficiency channel. And so my discussions are going to focus a little bit on some questions I had about the setting and some extensions that I think could help flesh out some of these policy predictions and make the paper even more impactful, right? And so the authors, as I said, use a number of reform events that are sort of staggered in waves in the early to mid 1990s. And so there are a variety of deregulation events across states. They happen in different years, although they do sort of cluster in one part of sort of the early mid 1990s. And what we can see from this map is largely that these deregulation events coincide in many cases, I think, with where coal is generally most produced. And so one thought that I had, and sort of we've got the distribution of this, we can see that most of the events happen in 1995. And I don't think that these clustering is a problem per se, but I think it would be helpful for the typical reader to sort of understand what were some of the drivers of these decisions. As I said, I think a lot of it, in particular at the state level, this largely coincides with where coal is extracted and used. And I think a broader discussion of sort of what prompted deregulation, in particular, what prompted this at different points in time. And I think this would just help to understand sort of the point of view of the policymakers and how we think about this impacting markets. Just sort of one comment on the setting overall. Again, I don't think this is a problem. They have some fairly compelling evidence on parallel trends. I just think as a reader, it would be helpful to understand the policy aspects of this a little bit more. All right, so related to this, Yaniv talked a little bit about this in his presentation, but I would have, I think it would be useful to have a little bit more discussion of how exactly things changed in terms of competition. So some more discussion on what the existing rules were that might have propped up less efficient incumbent firms. I was sort of curious, thinking about whether or not some of these restrictions might have allowed sort of foreign state competition. And so whether or not there was also an acquisition type shock to competition, or if this was just purely on pricing. And sort of related to this, I think it would have also been helpful to show or to look for sort of a first stage, right? To see to what extent market shares actually changed. And of course, it could be the case that the threat of entry was sufficient to change ex post behavior, but it would be useful, again, in sort of a policy evaluation framework to think about what the ex post changes were in actually product market competition from the utilities point of view. And again, while the authors do a great job showing how the mix of inputs have changed in the use of peak pricing, but I had a question about sort of maybe we could dig into a bit more the heterogeneity of which firms or which plants are driving some of these effects. So the authors find that the decline is coming from states where electricity costs were highest. Their interpretation is this is a measure of high pre-shock costs, since in many cases these this regulation regulated the consumer's electricity price as a function of the firm's production cost. And so this is possible, although I had a slightly different interpretation, and this is more based on the regulations. And so the price of electricity itself is a top-line quantity. So some of this effect, I think, could also be coming from simply there being a higher incentive for firms to come in where prices are higher, right? And so this could also be due to the fact that some states just might be particularly inefficient at regulating. And so I was just wondering to what extent this could also be coming from, in some sense, the relaxation of a larger distortion engendered by maybe bad regulations that were inefficiently propping up particularly bad firms. And so this could also be due to sort of the change in regulation itself, as opposed to just sort of the cost structure. And it might be interesting to see if there are particular states or particular regulations that would allow you to perturb some of this. Could you more directly measure sort of pre-existing efficiency of pollution? That is to say, for sort of a given input type, how efficiently was output generated for sort of each plant? And again, this I think would help understand the economics of how competition changes interact with the incentives to become more more environmentally efficient or more production efficient. Sort of again, and this is potentially some of my ignorance on these regulations, but I was curious if acquisitions or plant closings could explain some of this effect. And so sort of natural literature that I thought to link to is the literature on trade and emissions. And so there are a bunch of papers that have looked at import competition, things like the imposition of NAFTA on pollution behaviors using the toxic release inventory. They generally don't find that plant closings or acquisitions are particularly important. I was just curious if you might find some of these margins in your setting where everything's domestic. And this just might be something that would help you dig into the effects of why these emissions are changing above and beyond changes in input mix. And so I guess the last point I'm going to think about, I'm going to make in this discussion is thinking a little bit about the net effects, right? And so my thoughts when reading this is that effectively these shocks potentially had two effects on these firms. On the one hand, they seem to have increased productivity, which would be good for shareholders. At the same time, they also decreased rents, which would be bad for shareholders. And so my question is, which of these two effects might dominate, right? And so can this be something that tells us, or that we can learn about these trade-offs between financial performance and environmental management? Can this maybe help policymakers understand the cost and benefit side of pollution regulations? And to the extent that this might actually be net beneficial for these firms, which frictions may have prevented firms from adopting these more efficient productions to begin with, right? So, for example, one might think about fixed costs being necessary for some of these changes. There might be a role for financial constraints or financial distress. We can think about there being myopic incentives. These are all questions that recent papers in literature have looked at. And I think that this paper can also say something about frictions that prevent efficient production and efficient use of energy resources. And in fact, I actually got very interested in this, and the authors were kind enough to send me some details on the timings of their shocks, and I did some very rough analysis on potential value effects. And so this is not the exact same sample. I'm using sort of CompuStat data. The time period I don't think is exactly the same, but when I looked at Tobin's Q, I in fact found that following this reform, valuations went up. So this might be something that would say that, again, the change in efficiency may have actually outweighed the loss in rent. To the extent that this might be true and might hold up in sort of the more careful analysis that the authors could do, I would just be curious to see which frictions may have impeded firms from becoming more efficient. I think this might serve as a useful addition to the paper, and sort of in line with the discussion that Yaniv was alluding to in his conclusion. And so just to conclude very briefly, this is a carefully executed paper that I think convincingly shows that emissions decline and production becomes more efficient after these state-level deregulation events. As a reader, I would have appreciated some more details on the initial conditions, and maybe these can lead to specific ways that the authors can test sort of how inefficient regulations have negative effects or spillover effects on environmental policies. And I think it would be an interesting idea to study some of these net effects and sort of compare loss in rent versus increase in efficiency. And again, this might allow them to say something about the frictions that impede efficient production and efficient use of environmental resources. Thank you.
All right, thanks very much, Pat. We have a couple of minutes. Yaniv, would you like to respond? And we also have a couple of minutes for questions. I suggest we move right to the next paper afterwards. So,
sure. We also have Lena. Maybe Lena, you want to say a few words?
Hello, everyone. Thank you, Pat, for your wonderful discussion. Let me maybe touch on the biggest things. So overall, we probably should flesh out better the decision to restructure, but overall, it was driven by high electricity prices that the regulator was trying to solve using the restructuring process. We do find that, and it did have in the first stage, as you mentioned, the effects that you would expect to see. Indeed, the market share of the peer firms dropped. In fact, you have entry from out of state and you have entry of non-utilities, which are, by the way, operating on newer technology, which is also related to the question that Per Stromberg had in the chat. So newer facilities do indeed use more efficient technology and rely on gas. So if you, in this paper, we look at the plant level analysis. So if you wish, we are focusing on the intensive margins, but if you consider the bigger market space, probably, and consider the extensive margins, probably the effect would even be bigger than that. Another point about acquisition of plants. So again, we do not really control for the ownership, and there is no movement from, let's say, IOUs to munis or vice versa. So from that standpoint, even if the structure of the industry has changed in terms of ownership, it probably will not affect our analysis. Market to book, really love this analysis. You really went outside of the box here. I am honestly, I think that's an interesting, this is a very interesting result. My personal take, when I typically see market to book on the left-hand side, is that it's the measure of growth opportunities. So I can see how restructuring in the state has potentially provided more growth opportunities for firms, but I think that's definitely an interesting angle for us to look at. Thank you.
All right, do we have any questions from other panelists? If not, then given that we're just on time, according to the schedule, let's take a 5-minute break and let's reconvene at in 5 minutes at 4:30. Thank you.